actually met Jake 10 days after he got out of prison. He robbed a pharmacy when he was 18 years old and he was addicted to drugs at age 14. So I met him at a singles ward hoedown at my local church, the first time that he stepped back into a church after so many years. And I saw this guy with tattoos coming out of his sleeves and this huge smile and this cowboy hat, and just somebody who was ready to, in my mind, be saved, which I had my own childhood trauma. So I think that that's how I found my self-worth. And I think that that's how a lot of us who do stay with abusers, that we find our self-worth is by saving somebody or rescuing somebody or helping them to see the light in themselves and the good in themselves. And there was light too. There were good things throughout the years, but there's also so much dark. So we met at the singles ward hoedown, and then he wasn't ever active in the church that I was, in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. He would come, but he never fully was converted or anything. But he would come, and there were lots of good things. He was very sweet to me. He would tell me that I was his light, and we got married about a year and a half later, and we were married for 9.5 years. And honestly, our marriage was hell on earth, but I had the biggest smile on my face the whole time. I found out the day that we got home from our honeymoon that he had relapsed on heroin a few days before our wedding. And so that was the first year of our marriage, was keeping him alive. He overdosed a few times, and he was trying to do better too. He was working at a couple of different rehab centers, and that's what he wanted to go to school for, because he wanted to help other people, and he was trying. And so since I could see the good, I couldn't see that the addiction was also, there were a lot of other abusive behaviors that were happening because of the addiction. I just called it addiction. But the gaslighting started very early on, and there was a lot of paranoia that started very early on, where if I talked to another guy at church or was smiley or friendly, I noticed really early that he would get really jealous, and he would think that I was hitting on the guy, even though I was just smiling. And so I made moves to avoid that. And I actually asked my bishop if I could be taken off of the welcoming committee because it made him so uncomfortable. And that's so sad looking back, that he was manipulating my light and trying to get me to hide my light even back then. So things got progressively worse and worse, but they also got progressively better and better at the same time, which is why it was so confusing. He was so sweet to me, and he would give me 50 different compliments a day. Even he had 3 affairs during the course of our 9.5-year marriage, which were heart-wrenching and horrible. But he was so sorry, and he hated himself. And he would say so many kind things to me every day. And then he would still go do these secret hidden things and accuse me of doing the things that he was doing. So I just never recognized it as abuse. I had some different people. Towards the end, COVID made things so much worse. During COVID, he got completely focused on me. I think he always had some paranoia where he thought that people at work were out to get him. And I just believed those things. I thought that that was really happening. But then it turned on me. When he was home all day, he became completely obsessed with what I was doing. He put cameras at every angle of the house. There was only one angle of the house that didn't have a camera, on the outside by my raspberries. And I remember just being able to let go of the fake cheery voice with friends and just calling a friend and just saying, "Hi, actually things aren't okay." Actually, I couldn't let go of the fake cheery voice. It stayed because that's all that I knew. But he needed to know where I was at all times, and he started accusing me of different affairs every day. He would accuse me of an imaginary person. He would accuse me of plotting to have him killed with neighbors because I got my hair done and it took 3.5 hours. So he became obsessed with those neighbors and obsessed with what I was actually doing and that we were against him. I had people who noticed how horrible things were, and they would reach out and try to do something, and I would just say, "We're okay. He's been drinking and we're working on it, and it's okay. I was convinced that if he could just believe that I was trustworthy, if he could just believe that I loved him, that everything would be okay. When you're in abuse, you can't see. You're completely blinded. There were a lot of years, especially after COVID, that it felt like he had a hand right here and that he was physically holding my head. And anytime that I tried to turn to family, anytime that I tried to turn to truth or to see what was really happening, it's like he would grab my face just metaphorically and hold it like this and make me feel like I was going to kill him or that I would devastate him and ruin his life, that there's nothing to live for if I did try to look anywhere else. So I didn't even think about leaving because he kept me in such survival mode of I just need to convince him that I'm not running away from him. And I think that a lot of women in abuse feel that exact same way, that we're responsible for them living. A lot of people go to saying that they'll commit suicide if you do threaten to leave. And so I felt very responsible for his life. So our marriage was full of a lot of good, which I call love bombing now looking back. He was always really nice to my children. I think that he was also love bombing, and he was nice, but he told them things this last 4 or 5 years that I was evil, he would call me names and say these horrible things that I was doing that were not true. And so even though he was nice to them and he never hit them or even really screamed at them, he was abusive to them by gaslighting and telling them that things were true that weren't true.
What was it like to finally be, there's probably a process there, right? With as always as there is with like divorce and coming out of a situation like that, but was it like almost like immediate relief when you felt when it was a divorce, or did that never end? Or like, I just kind of talk about like, so when you guys split, how?
So I'll just share how we split. So God loves me enough to send a flood to get me out of my marriage because I had so many people desperately reaching out. I had a few people actually tell me that they had thought about kidnapping me because things did become obvious and his erratic behavior became very obvious. And so but I wasn't willing. I was like, no, I have to save my family. I have to save him. But I just stayed completely away from men to be able to make him feel okay. I stopped going to the grocery store. He was convinced if I went to the grocery store, I must be going to go meet a boyfriend. If I watched more than one episode of a TV show, he would think that I was in love with the main character. And he would say these things kind of jokingly, or he would say these things crying. He would accuse me of these things crying. And so he would manipulate my loving heart and my empathetic heart to bend to his will, to bend to what he needed to be okay. So I stopped doing those things, and I had people reach out because they were concerned, and I just wasn't willing to see. And then we had a flood. I went downstairs. He was drinking heavily regularly, and I went downstairs to see how much of the tequila bottle he had drank the night before, and the ceiling was actually coming down. There was brown liquid. There was this much left in the tequila bottle, and then the ceiling was coming down with that same color brown liquid. And just a tiny little valve had leaked in my home upstairs, and we had to tear out everything. We had to tear out the ceiling, the floors, the cabinets. We had to tear everything out, and because of that, we had to have men in the house. And he went ballistic. Just having men in the house was not okay. So when the men were there, again, he went a little bit ballistic, and his parents helped him to go out of town for a week so that he could have some space while they tore everything out. And as soon as he had been gone for an entire day, I took my first full breath that I had taken since COVID. I needed to breathe. I wasn't breathing. When you're hyperventilating and you can't breathe, you can't see, you can't think about what's, more than just this close to you. So I took my first full breath, and when I breathed out, I just said, he can never come back. It's like I could finally see. My eyes were opened to the living hell that we had been living in daily for so long. So we separated at that point. And it was a living hell and just so hard. It took about 9 months for the divorce, and it was so hard. But I have love at home, and I have peace in my home. I didn't have that when he was there. So I have fought hard to have love at home and to have peace at home. And I think it's really fitting and really beautiful that at the funeral this morning, that was the opening song, was Love at Home, which is why I got a divorce, was to be able to make love at home possible for my children.
The divorce is final in 2022. Is that what I understand?
Yes.
If you don't mind, fast forward kind of to like this past year. And so I guess were you aware of Summer at that point, or just what was kind of your understanding? And then talk about your ex's behavior as far as, and then what you were trying to do about it.
So I've known Summer for almost 4 years. They've actually never been together. He's never been respectful of her as a girlfriend. I think he's been very manipulative to her, and that he's done the same thing to her, like made her feel like my kids need her light and that he needed her light. And so it's been very off and on since we were first separated. And Summer is such an innocent, vulnerable person. And I think that she saw hope in him and that she wanted to be helpful to him, and that he manipulated her heart big time. I know about one domestic violence situation that happened with them about 3 years ago, where he accused her of horrible things, and he called and accused me of the same things at that time. And I know that he was physically abusive to her at that time, and that her sister tried to help her and tried to get her out of that situation. But I think that she kept going back every few months or so. And so it's confusing because they weren't actually together, but he manipulated her big time. And she would be there for my kids' birthday parties. She was only ever just so completely kind anytime that I saw her.
And around May last year, so
Yes.
you started noticing kind of like, I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, but at least what I understand of the story, you started noticing like kind of like an escalation in concerning behavior out of him. Is that correct?
Yes. So what happened in May is my children told me that he was gone all night when I picked them up the next day, that he was gone all night and that he had been jumped in the neighborhood, walking through the nice neighborhood in Harriman that he lived in. He told my 11-year-old son, or 10 at the time, that he had been jumped. And my 10-year-old son came home and said, "So Mom, Dad had a huge cut under his eye and he had scratch marks all over the front of his neck. And he said he got beaten up by some gang members in the middle of the night." So first of all, I was very concerned, and I called the Harriman police the next day to find out if it's legal, number one, to leave a 10-year-old and a 6-year-old at home all night long unsupervised. And that's not illegal, which I was shocked about. And two, I felt very strongly that night that there was a woman who was attacked, because you don't get scratch marks all over the front of your neck by getting beaten up by men. You do that when you are assaulting a woman. That is where you get. So I called to just at least make an informative report. And I actually contacted Summer's sister at that time, because I had she'd been concerned about her before, to just make sure that Summer was okay.
And around that time, had you tried to get like a protective order, or was it like some sort of restraining order related to your children? Or tell me about that.
Yes. So in August, he had a complete meltdown. So I started trying to get full custody at that point. But it was in August where he called me and my children, and he told us that Summer had tried to kill him, that they were in his home, and that he had knife marks on his face, that he had all of these wounds all over his body from trying to get them out of his house, because her and others were trying to murder him. And I could tell just by talking to him that that was a hallucination, but I also did talk to the police to make sure. So he called the Harriman police to try to protect him, and there was nobody else there. It was a complete delusion. So he really was throwing knives at the doors at invisible people, and that's horrifying. That could have been my children. My children, they were supposed to be there that day that meltdown happened, but he said he had to work late. So thankfully my kids weren't there, and they didn't have knives that were hurled at them. So at that point, I saw how serious it was. that he's throwing knives at invisible people. And he was actually, somebody else called the police 2 days later in August because he was out on his front lawn fighting an invisible person and screaming and yelling. So the police came, and he admitted to the police at that time that he had had 6 drinks and that he had been using cocaine, but that there were these demons that were after him. So at that point, with the police reports and everything, I filed for a child protective order to protect my children, because right after that happened, I was supposed to just send my children with him 2 days later. How can I send my kids with somebody who's throwing knives at invisible people? That's terrifying, and it was denied. The 4th District Provo Court denied that because they said that it was mental health and that he should be protected. My children needed to be protected from those knives that were being thrown.
And so what was the response from the court?
Just no. It was, they didn't even hear our story at that time. They just said no.
Just as how it was characterized to me, but I want to make sure that that was accurate. So was it kind of like on mental health grounds that you're trying to get this protective order? Or
mental health and drugs, because he admitted to the police that he was on cocaine. So it was because of drugs and because of wild hallucinations and very dangerous hallucinations.
Well, what was the justification from the court for denying it?
The only thing that we saw was that he should be protected because of mental health. So that was the first time. The second time, November 14th, my children were with him when this happened, where he told my kids, he got in their faces and he said, "You guys, Summer and her brother are here and they are going to murder you guys. I will protect you. They are here to murder you." And this is my sweet little boy and my sweet little girl. They're 11 and 7 now at this point. And he took them outside behind his house in a field. And he pointed to a window, my daughter's window, and said, "Can you see those dark figures in your room? You can't see them because they hide in the walls. They hide in the walls, and so I'm the only one that can see them, but you guys can see them, right?" He was gaslighting and gaslighting and gaslighting my children, as he did to me every day during our marriage that last few years, telling me things that were not true, that I knew weren't true, but he was crying and trying to convince me that they were. And it messes with your brain so much. My sweet kids have had their brains so tangled by their dad. So he called the police again, and he tried to get my children to tell the police that my children saw them hiding in the walls. My poor kids were so confused. So he actually called his family, he called his parents and his brothers, and he asked them to help lock up the house. And so when I got there, he actually told all of those things to me. He told me that she was hiding in the walls, that she's so tiny that nobody can see her. And he had backpacks packed for my kids. He was about to take my children to go into hiding with backpacks. They were all packed by the door. And thankfully, I listened to the prompting to go over there. So I talked him into, I didn't have the court on my side. I felt like I didn't have the police on my side. But I thankfully was able to, in his crazed state, I was able to talk him into him getting to somewhere safe without the kids, and me just helping to settle the kids down for a few days, and then he could have them another time. I got him to calmly say, "Okay, yeah, you keep them safe and I'll go keep me safe." But he completely thought that these things that were not real were real and was telling that to my kids. And so at that point, I contacted Child Protective Services, as well as I tried to go through the justice court to get a protective order for my kids, because surely this man who's driving around, he drove around with them all day that day, and my daughter told me that he was drinking while he was driving that day. She told DCFS that he was drinking while he had them that day, and that was not enough for the court to think that my children needed protection or deserved protection.
So once again, you tried for a protective order in November.
Nothing. And I went another way. I went to the justice court the justice court is there to protect children. That is the reason that they exist. And he actually said that he would hear us this time. The other judge just said no. He wouldn't even hear our plea or anything. This judge did something different that isn't usually seen. He didn't say yes, but he didn't say no. And he gave us 2 weeks to come to court. But usually they just do a 2-week protective order. And neither judge would even give us a 2-week protective order, which is 2 weeks. Let's keep these kids safe for 2 weeks. So he said, I want to hear more information. So this particular judge at the Justice Court, I thought, at least he's going to hear us. There's no way. We have all of this evidence. We have the DCFS preliminary report where my son says that he's wobbling and drinking and driving with them, that he's seeing invisible people, where my daughter's saying he's drinking and driving with us every day that he has us, and we feel scared of our own dad. They had all of this information. The judge would not even review it. He just said, this sounds like a custody stunt, so you can take care of this in the other 4th District Court.
And so then you get to December. And was there an event that prompted that third attempt, or did you just try again at that point, or tell me what happened?
That was the court date that they had set after the November 14th date, and that had happened. He went into treatment in September, but I think that he was kicked out of treatment. And then in December, we went back into court, and it was the custody hearing. I had been fighting for full custody, and he had actually been fighting for 50-50 custody. Because I took some of the parent time down, he retaliated and he wanted to get more parent time. So the court dates, I had 3 court dates within 3 weeks, begging for my children's safety and begging for help. And they denied the protective order, and then the next week they denied another protective order. And then the next week, miraculously, he had gone back into treatment the day before. And so since he had done that, the commissioner at that time who was overseeing our case said, okay, I can see that this is a dangerous situation, so we're going to go ahead and we're going to give supervised visits. So he can have supervised visits when he gets out until your next court date in February. So we did get a tiny bit of protection. But I don't know what would have happened if he hadn't gone into treatment. I am just appalled at what could have happened. The police came to my door in the middle of the night because they thought it was my body. Her body, she was so brutally murdered that they couldn't tell. And I had police banging on my door that almost cried when I opened the door, and they asked if my children were alive. That could have been my children. He was seeing invisible people and invisible things. That could have been my children, and the judges did not do their part to protect them from that. My kids they would have been, if we didn't have that supervised visitation, my kids would have been with him for that entire last week of Christmas break. They would have been with him that whole time.
If there's a hope out of talking to us for the story, what do you hope that it is, either that the audience understands, or do you hope that maybe lawmakers take a new look at just how the laws are set up in a circumstance like this? Like, what do you hope ultimately comes out of your story?
My hope and my prayer and my ask is for people to have eyes that see, for judges to have eyes that see, that are willing to look at the evidence in front of them and make the right choice, for lawmakers to see that whether it's mental health, whether it's drugs, whatever it is, protect these children. For those who are in abuse, my prayer and my call to action is to have eyes that see, to take a deep breath and to have eyes that see. For those who, the neighbors of those who are in it, in that hidden emotional abuse or physical abuse, because emotional, it leads to the physical. It's for them to have eyes that see and to be willing to listen. I had a lot of people in my life who I've reached out to this last 6 months because I knew that he is capable of murder. I knew he was capable of this, and I reached out to people and they didn't listen. I think that they thought I was being dramatic, and I am not being dramatic. I needed to protect my children. So I want people to open their eyes, have eyes that see, and to understand emotional abuse and psychological abuse, and to shine light on this, because we need change in this world. These kids need to be protected.
Ray, any other questions?
When you look back to the early times, what do you wish you had known then or understand? Because I'm sure people will hear and think, well, why did she go out with a guy who just got out of prison? And I think you explained that pretty well, but can you kind of get into that a little bit?
Yes, because there's so many people like me, because we can see the good. We're really good, especially in Utah County culture. We are really, really, really good at seeing the good in people, and that's a good thing about us. But I had these rose-colored glasses on. When you have rose-colored glasses, it's dangerous because red flags just look like flags. We need to take off the lens of only seeing the good in people to see truth, to see the red flags and to act accordingly. We need to not have fear-colored lenses, which I definitely tried for a while too. We need to have truth-colored lenses. So I wish that I could go back and give myself those truth-colored lenses and see the good still, but also see the dangers, and to get myself out of that minefield, to get my children out of that minefield. So I would love to go give everybody else that's in those situations that they can see the good, because he never hit me. Jake never hit me. He did other physical things that were really scary. He punched a hole in the wall by my head, but most of the abuse was him crying next to my bed, begging me to just admit the horrible things I was doing. Most of the abuse was gaslighting and twisting my brain while he was smiling or joking or crying. That's so confusing. It is so confusing. So that's what I would want, is to be able to see those dangers, see those monsters hiding at the other side, and to protect myself better, to protect my children better, and to protect other people better, to understand what emotional abuse looks like and the dangers. Because I always just woke up each next day and I thought I was kind. I was not kind. True kindness is making that harder right choice and loving him, loving others, loving my children and myself enough to make that harder right choice, to see the truth and to set those strong boundaries because of the truth. That's true kindness, not staying with somebody because you can see a little bit of good. True kindness is making that harder choice to protect yourself and your children. That is kindness.